Have you ever found yourself giving so much to your family that you began to feel invisible? Maybe you told yourself it was the right thing to do, that love means sacrifice. But over time, those sacrifices started to chip away at something deep inside you, your sense of self, your energy, your dreams. You're not alone in feeling this way. Today, we'll explore the emotional cost of overgiving, a silent struggle that so many carry. Together, we'll reflect on how to find a balance between love and self-preservation, because true harmony begins with caring for ourselves. Before we continue, friends, I kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel. It only takes a second for you, but for me, it's an extra motivation to keep creating videos. I'd also really appreciate a comment. Thank you for your support, and now, let's continue with the story. Let me tell you about Linda. She's a retired nurse, the kind of woman who has always been the pillar of her family. If her children needed her, she was there, no questions asked. When her daughter's daycare arrangement fell through, Linda rearranged her life to babysit her 2 young grandchildren, waking up at 5 a.m. every morning to drive across town. She dipped into her savings more than once to help her son when his small business struggled. Weekends became a blur of family commitments, baking for school events, organizing birthday parties, and volunteering to help wherever needed. At first, Linda found joy in being needed. She told herself, "This is what family is about. This is my role." But slowly, cracks began to show. She noticed that she hadn't read a novel in years, something she used to love. Her garden, once her sanctuary, was overgrown with weeds. And her health began to decline, with sleepless nights and a persistent ache in her back she couldn't shake. Linda brushed it off as a normal part of aging. But deep down, she felt an emptiness she couldn't quite name. The turning point came one Saturday evening. Linda had planned to attend a community art class she'd been excited about for weeks, something just for her. But an hour before the class, her daughter called in a panic, needing a last-minute babysitter. Without hesitation, Linda canceled her plans. Sitting on the couch later that night, her grandchildren asleep in the next room, she realized how rarely she said no. That evening, she asked herself a hard question. When was the last time I put myself first? Linda's story is one of quiet love, but it's also one of loss. The loss of her own identity beneath the weight of her giving. And here's the thing. Her family didn't mean to take her for granted. They adored her and relied on her because she was always there. But without boundaries, love can sometimes take more than it gives. This struggle isn't unique to Linda. Across cultures, the act of giving is celebrated, often seen as the ultimate expression of love. From grandparents who raise their grandchildren to parents who sacrifice careers for their kids, the pattern repeats itself. But here's a question worth asking. Can love still be love if it comes at the expense of your own well-being? Linda began to notice something else. Her overgiving wasn't just affecting her. Her daughter, used to having Linda step in at a moment's notice, rarely planned ahead. Her son, who had grown accustomed to financial support, stopped looking for other ways to stabilize his business. And the grandchildren, as much as they loved Linda, didn't see her as a person with her own needs and desires. Slowly, Linda realized that her constant availability was unintentionally enabling behaviors that weren't healthy for anyone. The journey to reclaiming herself wasn't easy. At first, Linda felt guilty even thinking about saying no. But she started small. She let her daughter know that she could babysit on certain days, but not others. She stopped offering money to her son unless he specifically asked. And even then, she carefully weighed whether it was something she truly wanted to do. These small shifts were uncomfortable at first, but over time, they brought unexpected clarity. Linda discovered that her family didn't collapse without her constant presence. In fact, they began to adapt, becoming more self-reliant. This isn't just about boundaries. It's about redefining what love looks like. Love doesn't have to mean saying yes every time. It can mean showing your family how to stand on their own 2 feet. It can mean modeling self-respect and self-care, teaching them through your actions that everyone deserves a full and meaningful life. Of course, none of this happens overnight. For Linda, the most challenging part was learning to value herself again. She began to take long walks in the mornings, reconnecting with her love for nature. She joined that art class after all, discovering a talent for watercolor painting she never knew she had. And perhaps most importantly, she learned to sit with her own thoughts, to hear her own voice amidst the noise of others' needs. Linda's story holds a mirror to the quiet struggles many of us face. Have you ever given so much of yourself that there was nothing left? Have you ever felt torn between the love you have for your family and the love you wish you could give yourself? If so, know that you're not alone, and know that it's never too late to reclaim your sense of self. As we continue this journey, we'll explore how overgiving can subtly erode our relationships, turning love into obligation. We'll talk about the tools we need to set boundaries with kindness, to give from a place of abundance rather than exhaustion. Because true love isn't about losing yourself. It's about finding a way to care for others without forgetting who you are. For now, I want to leave you with this thought. What would it feel like to say yes to yourself for a change? To prioritize your own needs, even if just for a moment? It's not selfish. It's necessary. And it might just be the first step toward building a life that feels as good as the love you give. Margaret had always been the first to say, "Whatever you need, I'm here." Those words came so easily, fueled by a lifetime of love and a deep sense of responsibility. But she had never considered what it cost her to keep saying them. Her family depended on her as a constant, someone they could always count on. At first, it felt good, gratifying even. But over time, what began as an act of love started to feel like an obligation she hadn't signed up for. The realization didn't come all at once. It was gradual, like a fog lifting. One day, Margaret found herself in the grocery store, exhausted after a long day of watching her grandchildren, and realized she couldn't even remember what she had come to buy. Later, she sat in her car, staring at the steering wheel, feeling not just tired but empty. The things she once enjoyed, gardening, reading mystery novels, going to church events, felt like distant memories, eclipsed by a schedule that revolved entirely around others. Margaret's love for her family had become so intertwined with her identity that the thought of saying no felt almost impossible. But the cost of always saying yes was becoming clearer. Her body ached, her patience wore thin, and a quiet resentment had started to build, a feeling she hated to admit, even to herself. One Sunday evening, everything came to a head. Margaret's daughter, Emily, called in a panic, asking her to watch the kids again because her sitter had canceled. Margaret had been looking forward to a rare evening to herself. But before she could stop herself, the word "sure" slipped out of her mouth. As she hung up the phone, she felt tears welling up. "Why can't I just say no?" she thought. That night, she lay awake, replaying the moment over and over, angry at herself for giving in yet again. Margaret realized that something had to change. She began to reflect on how her overgiving was shaping her relationships, not just with her family but with herself. She thought about Emily, who had grown so used to Margaret's help that she rarely planned for alternatives. Her son, Ryan, leaned on her financial support in a way that made her worry about his future independence. And her grandchildren, as much as they adored her, had come to see her presence as a given, not a gift. Margaret had taught her family to depend on her so completely that they no longer saw her as a person with her own needs. The decision to set boundaries didn't come easily. Margaret was terrified of how her family would react. What if they felt abandoned? What if they grew resentful? Still, she knew she couldn't keep living this way. She started small. The next time Emily asked for help, Margaret paused before answering. "I can't tonight," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've already made plans." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Emily responded, "Oh, okay. I'll figure something out." It wasn't the warmest response, but it was a start. Margaret braced herself for resistance, and it came in waves. Emily began calling less often, unsure of whether she could count on Margaret the way she used to. Ryan sent her a frustrated text when she declined to help with his rent one month, accusing her of being unsupportive. Even her grandchildren seemed confused when Margaret started declining invitations to every school event or weekend outing. But as the weeks went on, something unexpected began to happen. Emily, forced to rely on herself more, began making backup plans and even found a reliable sitter who lived nearby. Ryan, though initially upset, took on extra shifts at work and started to feel proud of handling his own finances. And Margaret's grandchildren, while initially surprised, started to see their grandma in a new light, as someone who had her own life and interests. For Margaret, the hardest part wasn't dealing with her family's reactions. It was confronting her own feelings of guilt. Every time she said no, she felt a pang of doubt, wondering if she was being selfish. But over time, she noticed something else, a growing sense of relief. By setting boundaries, Margaret wasn't just protecting her time, she was reclaiming her sense of self. The changes in her relationships weren't immediate, nor were they always smooth, but they were profound. Margaret noticed that her conversations with Emily became more meaningful, less focused on logistics and more about connection. Ryan began asking for advice, not money, and their relationship started to feel more balanced. And Margaret's grandchildren, while still adjusting to the new dynamic, began to look forward to the special moments they shared, moments that were now filled with genuine joy, not obligation. As months turned into years, Margaret saw the long-term effects of her decision. Her health improved as she made time for regular walks and yoga classes. She rediscovered old hobbies, like painting and gardening, and even made new friends through a local book club. Most importantly, she found a sense of peace she hadn't felt in decades. Margaret's love for her family hadn't diminished. It had deepened, enriched by the knowledge that she could care for them without losing herself in the process. Margaret's story is a testament to the idea that boundaries aren't barriers, they're bridges. By setting limits, she didn't push her family away. She gave them the space to grow, to take responsibility, and to see her as more than a role or a resource. She taught them a lesson they might not have learned otherwise, that love is strongest when it's rooted in mutual respect. Have you ever felt like Margaret, torn between your love for your family and your own well-being? If so, know this: it's never too late to make a change. Setting boundaries isn't about rejecting your loved ones. It's about showing them how to love you in return. And as Margaret learned, the most powerful love you can give is the kind that leaves room for yourself. In the next part of this journey, we'll explore how overgiving doesn't just impact the giver. It shapes the entire family dynamic in ways we might not expect. What if the greatest act of love isn't giving everything but giving wisely? Let's continue to unravel this together. Paul had always been a planner. As a high school teacher, he spent decades building a stable, modest life, carefully saving a portion of each paycheck. He wasn't wealthy, but he was diligent, putting away funds for his retirement and dreaming of the day he could travel with his wife, attend local theater productions, and spend quiet mornings tending to his garden. By the time Paul retired, his savings stood at a comfortable $250,000, not extravagant, but more than enough to give him the security and freedom he'd worked so hard to achieve. But life rarely goes as planned. Just a year into his retirement, Paul's daughter, Sarah, lost her job during an economic downturn. The rent on her apartment was overdue, and she was panicked about how to care for her two young children. Without hesitation, Paul stepped in, covering $2,000 in overdue rent and helping her with groceries until she found her footing. At least, that was the plan. Months turned into a year, and Paul found himself contributing $1,200 monthly to cover Sarah's living expenses. Each check he wrote felt like a lifeline for her, but a small voice in the back of his mind began to ask, "How long can I keep this up?" Not long after, Paul's son, Michael, approached him with an idea for a new business, a small tech startup he was passionate about. Michael had already drained his own savings trying to get it off the ground, and now he needed $20,000 to secure a crucial piece of equipment. Paul hesitated. He could see how much the project meant to his son, and he didn't want to crush his dream. Telling himself it was an investment in his family's future, he withdrew the money from his retirement account and handed it over. But the business struggled, and the profits Michael had promised never materialized. Over the next 3 years, Paul's financial contributions snowballed. Emergency expenses, unexpected bills, even small gifts for his grandchildren, it all added up. By the time he sat down to review his accounts, his $250,000 savings had dwindled to less than $90,000. Staring at the figures on the screen, Paul felt a wave of nausea. The safety net he had spent a lifetime building was unraveling, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. The realization hit him like a freight train. His love for his children had driven him to the edge of financial ruin. But what hurt more was the quiet guilt that came with it. The feeling that he had failed as a father, that his children still needed him because he hadn't prepared them to stand on their own. That night, as Paul lay awake in bed, he wrestled with an unbearable question. Had I done too much? Or not enough? The decision to set boundaries didn't come easily. Paul agonized over it for weeks, replaying every scenario in his mind. He imagined Sarah struggling to keep a roof over her kids' heads without his help. He pictured Michael's frustration if he couldn't secure the funds to keep his business afloat. And then there was a fear of what they might think of him, of being seen as selfish or abandoning them in their time of need. But each time he thought about dipping further into his savings, he felt a deeper pang of dread. He couldn't keep sacrificing his future for theirs. He had to find another way. When Paul finally sat down with Sarah and Michael, his heart was pounding. He chose a quiet Sunday afternoon at his home, hoping the familiar setting might ease the tension. As they sat at the dining room table, Paul began to speak, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I've always wanted to be there for you," he said, looking from Sarah to Michael, "and I'm proud of the people you've become. But I need to be honest. I can't keep supporting you financially. I've reached a point where I have to protect what I've worked for, not just for me, but for all of us." The room fell silent. Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment, and she looked down at her hands. "I didn't realize things were so tight," she said softly. "I never meant to take advantage." Michael, on the other hand, stiffened. "Dad, I thought family was supposed to help each other," he said, his tone sharp. "Are you saying you don't believe in me anymore?" Paul took a deep breath, his chest tightening. "It's not about belief, Michael. It's about balance. I've been helping because I love you, but I need to start taking care of myself too. If I don't, there won't be anything left for any of us." The days that followed were tense. Sarah called less often, clearly hurt by the conversation, though she eventually sent Paul a heartfelt message thanking him for everything he'd done. Michael remained distant, avoiding family gatherings and keeping his updates about the business brief. Paul tried not to take it personally, reminding himself that this wasn't about rejection. It was about giving his children the space to grow. Over time, the dynamics began to shift. Sarah started attending job training programs and found a part-time role that allowed her to pay her rent without help. Michael, though still struggling, found a local mentor who guided him in cutting costs and securing small-scale investors. Slowly but surely, they began to find their own footing. And for Paul, the relief was palpable. He no longer dreaded checking his bank account or answering late-night calls. He rediscovered the joy of spending money on himself. Whether it was upgrading his garden tools, joining a local hiking club, or finally booking a trip to Yosemite, a place he had dreamed of visiting for years. What Paul hadn't expected was how these changes deepened his relationships with Sarah and Michael. Without the shadow of financial dependency, their conversations became more open, more genuine. Sarah began calling to share stories about her kids, not to ask for money. Michael started seeking Paul's advice on managing stress, rather than on managing his business accounts. They were building something new, a bond rooted in respect, not obligation. Paul's story is one of sacrifice, yes, but also of rediscovery. He learned that setting boundaries wasn't about closing doors. It was about opening new ones. Doors that led to healthier relationships and a future he could look forward to. And while the road wasn't easy, it was worth it. Because at the end of the day, love isn't about giving until there's nothing left. It's about knowing when to say, I trust you to stand on your own. Have you ever found yourself in Paul's shoes? Have you ever felt torn between helping your family and protecting your own well-being? If so, remember this, you're not alone. And it's never too late to choose yourself. In our next part, we'll explore the dreams we often keep hidden, the ones we sacrifice for others, only to wonder if it's too late to bring them to life. Let's uncover those dreams together. Dreams have a way of lingering, don't they? Even when life seems to sweep them aside, they sit quietly in the corners of our minds, waiting for the right moment. For Ruth, her dream of visiting the ocean had been with her for as long as she could remember. She could picture it vividly, the endless waves stretching toward the horizon, the cool breeze carrying the scent of salt, the feeling of sand beneath her feet. It was more than just a place to her. It was a promise she had made to herself. But like so many promises we make, it had been buried under the weight of everything else. For decades, Ruth's life revolved around others. First her children, then her grandchildren. She prided herself on being the person they could always count on. And yet, there was a growing ache inside her, a quiet sense of loss she couldn't quite name. It wasn't until that summer barbecue, standing in her backyard surrounded by family, that the feeling crystallized. Her daughter's words, "I don't know what I'd do without you," were meant as gratitude. But Ruth felt them like a mirror reflecting back all the ways she had disappeared into the role of caretaker. That night, she stood at her bedroom window, staring at the moonlit yard, and asked herself a question she hadn't dared to before. When did I stop being me? The answer didn't come easily, but it came with clarity. Ruth realized that she had spent so long pouring into others that her own cup had run dry. She decided it was time to change that. The next morning, she pulled out an old journal she hadn't opened in years and began writing down the dreams she had set aside. The list was longer than she expected. Visit the ocean, learn to paint, take a train ride across the country. Each entry felt like a small piece of herself she had forgotten. Her first step was a beach. It wasn't a grand trip, just a drive to a coastal town a few hours away. But for Ruth, it might as well have been a journey across the world. As she stepped out of her car and onto the sandy shore, a wave of emotion swept over her. The rhythmic sound of the waves was like a heartbeat, steady and calming. She kicked off her shoes, letting the sand sink between her toes, and walked toward the water. The cold waves lapped against her feet, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of gratitude, of finally giving herself permission to feel alive. That trip to the beach wasn't just a day away. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Inspired by the peace she felt there, Ruth decided to pursue another dream from her list: learning to paint. She signed up for a beginner's art class at the local community center, feeling both excited and nervous. On the first day, she sat at a table surrounded by strangers, holding a paintbrush she hadn't touched since grade school. The instructor, a warm woman with a kind smile, encouraged them to paint something that brought them joy. Ruth closed her eyes and pictured the ocean, its shades of blue and green dancing in her mind. Her first attempts were clumsy, but with each stroke of the brush, she felt a sense of accomplishment that was entirely her own. As weeks turned into months, Ruth began to notice changes, not just in herself, but in her relationships. Her newfound joy was infectious. At family dinners, she would excitedly show her grandchildren her latest paintings, inviting them to join her with their own crayons and markers. Her daughter, initially unsure about Ruth's decision to pull back from babysitting, began to see her mother in a new light, not just as a caregiver, but as a person with her own passions and dreams. "Mom," she said one evening, watching Ruth laugh with the kids over a messy art project. "I've never seen you like this before. You seem lighter." Ruth's transformation didn't stop there. Encouraged by her daughter's words, she planned a short trip to visit a small town she had read about years ago. There, she wandered through cobblestone streets, explored little antique shops, and chatted with locals at a cozy cafe. For the first time in years, she felt untethered, free to move at her own pace, guided only by her curiosity. It was a feeling she hadn't realized she'd been missing. But perhaps the most profound change was how Ruth began to see herself. She no longer defined her worth by how much she could do for others. Instead, she found value in simply being, in allowing herself to dream, to create, to explore. And in doing so, she discovered that her family's love for her wasn't conditional. They didn't need her to be everything for them. They just needed her to be happy. Ruth's story is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to reconnect with the parts of yourself you've left behind. Have you ever felt like Ruth, putting your dreams on hold for the sake of others? Have you ever wondered if those dreams are still waiting for you, somewhere in the quiet corners of your heart? If so, let her journey inspire you. Because the truth is, your dreams matter. Not just for what they bring to you, but for how they light up the lives of those around you. When you give yourself permission to live fully, you show the people you love what it means to truly thrive. As we move forward, let's explore the fears that often hold us back from pursuing those dreams. What happens when we confront the doubts and insecurities that keep us from living the life we want? Let's uncover that together. Evelyn stood on a cobblestone street in Paris, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the buildings. The scent of freshly baked bread wafted from a nearby boulangerie, and the sound of laughter and clinking glasses spilled out from a bustling cafe. She clutched a small notebook in her hands, jotting down the details of the moment. The taste of the buttery croissant she had just savored, the way the Seine shimmered under the bridges, and the joy of being completely untethered, answering only to herself. It wasn't just a trip, it was a homecoming to the parts of her she thought she had lost. The decision to come here hadn't been easy. There were moments of doubt, whispers of guilt that crept in when she booked her plane ticket. But as Evelyn wandered through the Musée d'Orsay, marveling at Monet's brushstrokes, or sat alone on a park bench, listening to the melody of street musicians, she felt a quiet affirmation rise within her. I belong here. I deserve this. Her days in France were filled with small, meaningful discoveries. She learned the art of ordering coffee in French, stumbled upon a flower market that smelled of lavender and roses, and struck up a conversation with a retired teacher from Belgium who shared her love for literature. Every experience added a layer to her sense of self, reminding her that life was about more than routines and responsibilities. It was about presence, wonder, and a willingness to step into the unknown. When Evelyn returned home, her family gathered eagerly to hear about her adventures. The photographs she shared weren't just snapshots of places. They were glimpses of her transformation. Her daughter noticed it right away. "You're glowing, Mom," she said, her voice tinged with admiration. Even her grandchildren, fascinated by her stories of French bakeries and towering cathedrals, saw her in a new light. Not just as their grandmother, but as a woman with her own passions and stories. Evelyn's journey wasn't just about a trip abroad. It was a testament to the power of choosing yourself. Her story encapsulates everything we've explored throughout this journey: the courage to set boundaries, the importance of prioritizing self-care, and the fulfillment that comes from pursuing long-held dreams. These aren't just ideas. They're lifelines, offering us a way to live not just for others, but for ourselves. As we come to the end of this conversation, take a moment to reflect. What would it look like for you to take that first step toward the life you've been quietly dreaming of? It doesn't have to be a trip to another country or a grand gesture. Sometimes, it's as simple as setting aside an hour for yourself, saying no to something that doesn't serve you, or rediscovering a hobby that brings you joy. These small acts are seeds, and with care, they grow into a life of balance, fulfillment, and peace. If Evelyn's story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What dream have you been holding on to? What small step could you take today to bring it closer to reality? Share your reflections in the comments below. Your story might just inspire someone else to take their own first step. And if you found value in this journey we've shared, consider subscribing to stay connected. Together, we'll continue exploring what it means to live a life of purpose, joy, and connection. Because no matter where you are in your journey, it's never too late to rewrite your story. The choice is yours. But remember, every step you take, no matter how small, is a step toward becoming the person you were always meant to be. Until next time, take care of yourself and don't forget to keep dreaming.